Hi, everybody, and welcome. This lecture or talk actually will be in English, and as a courtesy to our speakers, I will also keep the introduction of the society, the presentation of the society in English. So this is a seminar in the series to celebrate the fact that this association, the Swedish Society for Philosophical Practice, has its 10th anniversary this year. And so we're proud of that. And so we have approximately one seminar per month, both international and national. And so my name is Tulsa Jansson. I am the founder and also now again back as chairman of the board, which is exciting. And just short, SSFP, the abbreviation is then a non-profit organization working to have a more of a philosophizing activity in society outside of academia, meaning basically community of inquiries mostly, even though we also have a separate section that has sort of counseling, which is then one-on-one. And Tom here, who started the meeting, he's the treasurer, also on the board, and he will help out a little bit with maybe moderating if there are things that I miss. And before I start the presentation of our talkers or speakers, I would like to just outline the hour to come, which is Megan and Maughn's talk, of course. And if you have any questions regarding clarification, for instance, language, if there's a word you don't understand or meaning you don't understand, then that's fine, just post that or raise your hand and we'll try to spot that, or alternatively, you use the symbol raise hand in Zoom. Otherwise, after this half hour of talk, then there will be approximately half hour for questions or discussion. And then you can also raise your hand, or you could post a question in the chat. And both me and Tom will try and survey that. So who will be here? We're very honored to have Maughn Gregory and Megan Laverty with us. Megan Laverty, she's an associate professor of philosophy and education at Teachers College, Columbia University. She teaches graduate courses on philosophy of education, ethics and education, and aesthetics and education. Her primary research interests are the history of philosophy of education, moral philosophy and its significance for education, and philosophy with children and adolescents, that's hard, in schools. She is the author of Iris Murdoch's Ethics, a consideration of her romantic vision, Bloomsbury 2007, and the editor of 2 pre-college philosophy textbooks with Oxford University Press. She co-edits the Philosophy for Children Founders series, Routledge, with Maughn Rollins Gregory, which includes In Community of Inquiry with Anne Margaret Sharp, Philosophy, Childhood and Education from 2017, Gareth B. Matthews, The Child's Philosophers, 2022. So that's something forthcoming then. Yeah. And Matthew Lipman and the Educational Role of Philosophy. So that's also forthcoming. She's co-editor with David T. Hansen of the 5-volume series, A History of Western Philosophy of Education, Bloomsbury 2021. So over to Maughn Rollins Gregory. He's a professor of educational foundations at Montclair State University, USA, where he succeeded Matthew Lipman as the director of the Institute for the Advancement of Philosophy for Children in 2001. He publishes and teaches in the area of philosophy of education, philosophy for children, pragmatism, gender studies, and Socratic and contemplative pedagogies. He is co-editor of the Routledge International Handbook of Philosophy for Children, Routledge 2017, and with Jane Laverty, the Routledge series Philosophy for Children's founders. He has edited a number of special journal issues on philosophy for children and is currently serving as the inaugural research coordinator for the International Council of Philosophical Inquiry with Children. He also serves as Vice President for Personal Grievance Officer for the American Federation of Teachers. So that's impressive. Please take the floor, Megan and Maughn.
Thank you. Thanks, Tulsa. We really appreciate this opportunity. We're so happy to be here, and I'm happy to see some familiar faces. It's great to be reunited with you. So I'm going to share my screen, and Megan and I, as she said, we're going to talk for about a half an hour, and then we hope to have a nice discussion with you here. Tom, it says that I'm disabled from sharing my screen. Can you make me a co-host again, please? Try now. Okay, thank you. I'm going to take a personal 30 seconds. So are you seeing this now? Okay. I'm going to take a personal 30 seconds and just share with you my Swedish ancestors. These are my Swedish ancestors. James B. Jensen was my great-grandfather, born in Gusnava in 1875. His mother, Maria Johnsdotter, was born in 1852 in Genarp. She immigrated to the United States and brought her 6-year-old James with her, and then later she brought her mother, Christina Olsdotter, who was born in Asarp. So I'm very proud and happy to be presenting to you today the Swedish Society, and I hope to get there to my ancestral homeland sometime and be with you in person. All right, now for our presentation. So these are the titles of the books that Tulsa just read off to you. Unfortunately, the monograph series they first come out in library editions, in hardback, very sturdy, very expensive library editions. But then about a year later, they come out in paperback. So the book on Anne Sharp is out in paperback now. The book on Gareth Matthews, the publication date is technically 2022, but it's actually coming out next month in August. So it's really 2021. It'll be here soon. And then the one on Matthew Lipman is in development right now. So these are the first three in the series. Let me just say very quickly that philosophy for children, depending on how you define it, is something that's been going on for centuries. I mean, Gareth Matthews says that it goes back to Socrates, who we know had philosophical discussions with adolescents, with youth in ancient Greece. And we know that philosophy has been a subject in secondary schools in many countries for centuries. So the idea of teenagers, at least, doing philosophy has been around for hundreds of years. But the idea of younger children doing philosophy started, the current movement, or I should say, started in the late 60s, early 1970s. And these three people were figurative in the beginning of that movement. So Megan and I are looking back at how they first understood what they were doing and why they were doing it and how they were doing it and the disagreements they had, to see what we can learn. So when the title of our series is Founders, and we're using that word, we're identifying founders as people who developed a unique and an influential approach to the practice of philosophizing with children. And as I just indicated, they did not understand it the same way. There were a lot of differences, theoretical differences and practical differences, differences in practice. And we find that tremendously illuminating to learn about those differences. And what we found is that many of the current debates that people are disagreeing about today in the global philosophy for children movement have their origins way back in the early 1970s with these founders. And so we think it's important to revisit some of their writings and study what they were talking about. And so, as this slide says, we're not attempting to resolve those debates, but we're attempting to refresh our understanding of those debates by revisiting the work of these early people in the movement. And we think that that's really healthy for the movement. We don't think the movement should be a unified movement where everybody does it the same way and understands it the same way. In particular, the way people understand philosophy itself, and the way people understand childhood or children, and the way people understand education, because a lot of this is understood as pre-college philosophy education, for children. People understand those fundamental concepts in very different ways. And so revisiting that and seeing what we can learn from the founders, we think is quite important. Oh, I just put this slide here to remind me to, I'll share with you in the chat, if anybody's interested, and there's a discount that the publisher has shared with us to share with you. All right, so now we're going to talk about each of the founders just for a few minutes. And as Tulsa said, please interrupt with questions if you have some clarification questions as we go through. Megan, do you want to talk about Anne's early biography?
Sure. Thanks, Maughn. I might take these off. I have a lot of background noise. I live in New York, and they're pulling up the street at the moment. So there are jackhammers and cement saws, and just about everything you can imagine is going on just on the corner there. So I'll try this for a little while. And I just too want to thank you all for the invitation to be here, even though I don't have any Swedish ancestors. I'm still delighted. So Anne was born in, what's nice about the slides is that you can read them for yourselves. I think she was born in Brooklyn, New York, to Irish immigrant parents. And she received her Master of Arts in American and Latin American history, which sort of is important because she retained that interest in Latin America throughout her life and spent the latter part of her life very active in the Philosophy for Children movement in Latin America. I mean, she was active worldwide, but that held a special place in her mind and heart. We also note here that prior to getting her EDD, she did teach in some historically Black universities in the United States. The two of them here are Fayetteville State College and Virginia Union University. And we write about this in the introduction to the book on Anne, that it was such a very important period for her in terms of her waking up to the racial injustices that existed in the United States. And that's something that she retains and brings to the Philosophy for Children movement. She did get her EDD from the University of Massachusetts in Amherst in 1973. And while she was getting her EDD, she was a house parent with her husband at the time, Vincent, at a Shaker Village summer camp. And she was also a house parent at the Hampshire Country School. And she says too that these experiences of being a house parent and helping young people engage in self-governance was very influential in her thinking about the nature of the community of inquiry and also its value. And we share here the title of her dissertation because it was on Nietzsche, and it was on Nietzsche's philosophy of education. in particular his stress on the teacher as liberator. Yeah, just a few more details. As soon as she completed the EDD, she got a position as an assistant professor at Montclair State College, which is now Montclair State University. And it was in her first year there that she met Matthew Lipman. And the two of them sort of hit it off. Anne met Matt having read Harry Stottlemeyer's Discovery and just thought it was such a wonderful innovation that she was very eager to share her enthusiasm for the novel and the larger project. So in 1974, they co-founded the Institute together. They launched the Thinking Journal together, and they embarked on a very intense and very long collaboration together, creating curriculum and also theoretical materials. In 1981, Anne was appointed Director of Graduate Studies in Philosophy for Children at Montclair State University. She was also instrumental in the founding of the International Council of Philosophy for Children and creating the first doctorate in philosophy with a concentration in philosophy for children at the Universidad Iberoamericana in Mexico City. So this is just to give you an overview of Anne's scholarship. She published 5 books, and some of those books were edited and some of those books were authored by Anne. But what you notice is that Anne always worked in collaboration with someone else, either Matt or Ron or Lawrence Splitter. Collaborating was a very important part of her process, I think. She's published 28 book chapters, 58 journal articles, and 8 published interviews. So her record is very impressive. And we just wanted to kind of, it's only when you gather together the scholarship and see how much that she did that you realize how active they were and how much they contributed to debates at the time then and also today. This is her curriculum. So as well as the scholarship, she created curriculum. So this curriculum is intended to be used in practice with children or adolescents. And some of it had a specific purpose and some of it was just age appropriate. And as some of you may know with the Philosophy for Children materials, they can really be used with any age. But she also wrote short stories and co-authored the Lipman IAPC teacher manuals. So again, just very active and very productive in both aspects of the work. Maughn, I'm going to turn over to you for this bit because you know a little bit more about these influences.
One of the exciting aspects of our research into the founders has been sort of a genealogy of the development of this notion of a community of inquiry as a classroom practice. And it's something that Lipman and Sharp developed together, but they had each been students of John Dewey. I mean, not literally, but Lipman had correspondence with Dewey, but they had both studied Dewey and Charles Peirce. These were the American pragmatists who are credited with the idea of a community of inquiry as sort of a scientific community, beginning with Peirce. And Justice Buckler, the name here, is the man who hired Matthew Lipman to teach at Columbia University. Buckler was a scholar of Peirce. He wrote the first dissertation, which became a book after the publication of Charles Peirce's collected papers. And so he was an important Peirce scholar. And Matt Lipman actually, well, and Justice Buckler developed his own theory of human judgment that was partly based on Peirce, but also a deviation from it. And Matt Lipman studied Bucklerian metaphysics for about 10 years before he started working in philosophy for children. And that really influenced his theory of judgment. If you've read Matthew Lipman, you can't read Matthew Lipman without coming across this notion of judgment as sort of the goal of philosophical inquiry, that we're inquiring philosophically in order to arrive at well-informed, reasoned, sensitive judgments about what to say, what to make, what to do in the world. And Anne Sharp also studied Peirce and Dewey as part of her dissertation, but as Megan mentioned, she also had these very rich practical innovations that she had developed in her own teaching and at the historically Black colleges, and also in particular as parents in those boarding schools. And this is just a slide to show that a lot of people know Matthew Lipman's scholarship around the community of inquiry and philosophy for children, but Anne Sharp's scholarship, her writing was much less known, and this is one of the reasons we started this series with the book on Anne Sharp. And in the last interview that Matt Lipman gave before he died in 2010, he really credits Anne with making something out of this notion. Obviously, they developed it together, and it was something they wrote about together and talked about. But it was he says here that it was really Anne who got that ball in motion. That she first became really excited about it and recognized the notion of a community of inquiry as the central practice for the approach to philosophy for children that they would be developing. I think it's interesting to know that in the very beginning, Matt Lipman thought that it would just be a series of novels for children that would be sold in stores and drugstores. He didn't at first conceive of it as an educational program. And so it was like this, the idea that there needed to be a theoretical and practical construction of a practice, a dialogical practice to go along with the novels was something that they then worked on together. So this is just an outline of the book. What we did for all three books is we first of all gathered all the scholarship of all three, which in some cases was quite a chore. There didn't exist up-to-date CVs for any of these people, and so we did a lot of research just to put together a bibliography of everything they had published. And then we looked at everything they had published and we identified themes. So here you can see the themes we identified from Anne Sharp's published scholarship on the left. And then what we did was we invited a person who was an expert in each of those areas to read everything that she had written in that area and write an original essay in which they summarized what she had done, talked about her legacy, who influenced her, and critiqued what she had done from their point of view and from the point of view of other disciplines that they belonged to. And then they also chose one or two of Anne's essays in that theme to be reprinted in the book. And then, so that's the approach we've taken with all three of the books. And it's really, as I said, most people who are familiar with philosophy for children are much more familiar with Matt Lipman's writing, his theoretical writing about it, than they are with Anne Sharp's. And Anne has some very important departures from Lipman. She had some very different perspectives and brought a different perspective and background to a lot of her writing. So she edited 2 volumes of the Thinking Journal on Feminism, the relationship between feminism and philosophy for children. And she herself wrote a number of articles in that vein. She wrote about spirituality and religion and aesthetics in a way quite different from Matt. And the idea of caring thinking, which has become, I would say, controversial now in the philosophy for children world. The way that Anne wrote about it was quite different from the way that Matt wrote about it. So we think that's really interesting and important. And I think we need to speed up a little bit. So these are just a few critical questions that came up out of the book. These are questions that were raised by the people who wrote the critical essays about her work that are included in the book. So I think I'm just going to head right over to Gareth Matthews. It's interesting that Matthews died in 2011 and Sharp and Lipman both died in 2010. I think they died within like 5 months of each other. Quite interesting. I will just pause for maybe 30 seconds and let you read this little anecdote about how he got involved in the first place. Okay, so I think I'll just hurry through these slides on the biography. We can share these slides with you later, but Matthews was born in 1929 in Argentina. His parents were Christian missionaries at the time. He got his PhD from Harvard in '61 and was friends there with Stanley Cavell, who was a fellow doctoral student with him. He taught it in Virginia and Minnesota and ended up in Massachusetts, the University of Massachusetts Amherst. At the same time, he got there in '69, and then the year later, Ann Sharp went there for her studies, for her EDD, and she met him there, and we think that's where she met Matt Lipman also in the first place. There was an experimental Center for High School Philosophy that was meant to be the beginning of a national movement, and it didn't actually happen, but for a few years it was located at the University of Massachusetts, and Matthews became involved there. That's where he met Matt Lipman, and that's where he began his scholarship in this area. His first essay, The Philosophy in Children's Literature, was presented there at a seminar for high school teachers. In 1979, when Lipman and Sharp launched the first journal called Thinking, the Journal of Philosophy for Children, they invited Gareth Matthews to be a contributing editor. And his contribution was to write this column called Thinking in Stories. So the first page of every issue of the Thinking Journal was a one-page review of a children's book that had philosophical content that Gareth Matthews wrote. And in the course of his career, he wrote 58 of those reviews that we now have online at the IAPC website that you can enjoy. And we have now made that an active weblog, so people can contribute new reviews of children's books that have philosophical things going on in them. Matthews, as a philosophy professor, traveled around the world, and every time he went to a conference, he would try to organize work with the local school to do some philosophy with children in the local schools. He was fluent in German, and so he spent a lot of time in Germany, and his work in all of his books and writings in philosophy for children were translated into German. He became quite influential in the philosophy for children movement in Germany. He organized National Endowment for the Humanities seminars in the philosophy of childhood. As we will say, he was one of the instigators of the discipline of philosophy of childhood. Matthews was actually primarily a scholar of ancient and medieval philosophy. And these are a few of his books in that area. He published extensively in ancient philosophy and taught mostly. Most of his courses were in ancient and medieval philosophy. And so his writings in philosophy for children were sort of a secondary academic interest of his, and yet he was tremendously prolific in that area as well. So this is just a summary of his output, his scholarly output regarding philosophy for children. In the book on Matthews that comes out next month, we highlight these three academic fields that he helped to initiate. He was one of the first, he was sort of at the same time as Lipman and Sharp, he was philosophizing with young children. And he mostly used children's literature to do this. And so his first article, as I mentioned, was on philosophy and children's literature. And today, philosophy and children's literature is a huge subdiscipline of philosophy. Many conferences on it, books coming out every year. And it was really Gareth Matthews who initiated that field single-handedly. He was also one of the first people who wrote about philosophy of childhood, and his writings became very influential, not only in defining his own philosophy of childhood, but in sort of defining the parameters of what that subdiscipline should look like and should be doing. This is our summary of the book. Again, we looked at everything he wrote on philosophy for children, philosophy of childhood, philosophy of children's literature, and we identified these themes. We invited experts in each of these themes to read everything he wrote about in that area and write a critical essay reviewing and critiquing his work in that area. And in doing so, they raised many critical questions. And some of these we can discuss with you if you're interested. One of the ones that came up in a number of different ways, I think, is question number 2. The way that Matthews was so excited about children doing philosophy was in a particular way. I mean, Matthews was an analytic philosopher, and that comes out quite strongly in both the way he wrote about doing philosophy with children and in the descriptions of how he philosophized with children and the kind of philosophy he was doing with children. Was a particular kind of philosophy. And so other people have critiqued that as sort of essentializing both children and philosophy in a particular way that's problematic. Okay, maybe I'll turn it over to Megan.
Okay, thanks, Maughn. Yeah, so I'll just move quickly through the biographical information. So we're still in the process of compiling this, so we're learning as we go, but Matt was born in New Jersey, and his father was a German Jewish immigrant, and his mother was born in Pennsylvania, but also Jewish. He was in the war, as you can see, which we wanted to include. We also wanted to conclude, sorry about the background noise, sirens this time. He married Winona Moore. He actually married her in France because I think they weren't able to marry in the United States, in part because it was a mixed race marriage, And she went on to become the first African-American woman in the New Jersey State Senate. So yeah, it was a significant part of his life, and we think it informed his interest or his motivation really for thinking about philosophy for children in the context of democracy and an education for democracy. He got his PhD from Columbia, and he did not do his PhD under John Dewey, of course, but he did correspond with John Dewey, and the title of the dissertation was Problems of Art Inquiry. He went on to teach, as Maughn said, at Columbia University in the College of Pharmaceutical Sciences. He was hired by Justice Butler, and it really was his teaching in the college there that made him concerned about what he saw as students coming to the college not adequately prepared to engage in philosophical inquiry and thought with one another. So he really began to think about how it could be done at an earlier age, and that's what motivated him to write and to pilot Harry Stottlemeyer's discovery in 1969. He did move to Montclair State College in 1972 because he became increasingly more passionate about the possibilities of pre-college philosophy education. And as we said, together with Anne Sharp, he founded the Institute and the Thinking Journal. He did receive a couple of honorary doctorates throughout his life, and he was also director of the Institute for Critical Thinking from 1997 to 1999. And this is just a point of difference between Matt and Anne, even though they were collaborating on so much of the curriculum and scholarship around philosophy for children. Matt was more involved in and attentive to the debates in the critical thinking movement at the time. And it was a very active movement at the time that they were developing philosophy for children. So he had a role at the Institute at Montclair and was participating in many of the debates amongst critical thinking scholars and practitioners. The Institute for the Advancement of Philosophy for Children was awarded the Prize for Excellence and Innovation in Philosophy Programs from the American Philosophical Association in 2001. And that was a significant honor for Matt and the Institute. This is Lipman Scholarship, which is, I mean, you think of Matthews and Sharp and think of how productive they were. I think this is just overwhelming. You know, Matt wrote every day pretty much for his entire adult life. And these are some of the results of that dedication and commitment and discipline. Also the curriculum, you know, he wrote the novels for this curriculum, and then he co-authored the teacher manuals with Anne Sharp. And we just wanted to make a note too of the translations and cultural appropriations of this curriculum that has occurred in the last 50 years. It really is impressive and astounding. Yeah, so Lipman's areas of concentration, as we've said something about, is of course philosophy for children, which he initiated in the 70s with his novel Harry, which is not to say that it hadn't been going on in other forms and other ways since Socrates' time. He also became and developed his own theory of thinking and how to educate for thinking, in particular thinking of it as comprising critical, creative and caring thinking. And that was a big part of his work that doesn't figure so prominently in the work of Gary Matthews or Anne Sharp. And finally, he was really interested in the value of philosophy for education, not just as a subject in its own right, but as something that could inform how subjects across the curriculum were taught. He really saw it as a model for how to engage in an inquiring manner around any subject. And that's important because, you know, Matthews was very interested in the discipline of philosophy, and he was very interested in making that discipline available to children. And he was committed to philosophers being able to practice philosophy with children, but he wasn't so interested in thinking about philosophy as something that could become part of a curriculum that teachers taught in classrooms. And this was something that Matt was committed to, as was Anne. And so they thought a lot about how to reform education and how to reform it in such a way that it could incorporate philosophy in the fullest sense of that possibility. So yeah, this is the book. It reflects, I mean, it's still being written, drafted, people are researching and writing as we speak, but you can see here that we've identified different themes for Matt than what we have done for Sharp and Matthews. And we've focused here on the curriculum itself, We've also focused on philosophy as education for reasoning, and just a quick mention too of the social psychology in education, because Matt was very influenced by Vygotsky, and that seemed a significant feature of his work. Whereas Matthews had engaged critically with Piaget, and that was a feature of the Matthews book and of Matthews' work. Lipman sort of had believed in Piaget and then moved away from Piaget and embraced a more Vygotskian perspective. So yeah, we're looking forward to seeing how this book develops. And these are some of the questions that emerged, and we're happy to discuss these too. I suppose one of the questions that Maughn and I have been talking a little bit about is the first one, particularly in light of the interest in social justice education today, and the worry that Lipman, Sharp, and Matthews to an extent were sort of too naive and optimistic about what the community of inquiry could achieve just by virtue of the procedures. There seems to be, there's kind of being pressure being put on that idea today by Darren Chetty and others, sort of arguing that without a commitment on the part of the facilitator to ameliorating, racism, sexism, and poverty, and also curriculum that addresses these issues, the community of inquiry itself is not sufficient. And it might be necessary, but it's a long way from what we need if we're really going to address some of these issues in the interest of democratic education. We've also talked a little bit about the last one too, and about thinking about sort of today, where P4C is today, or Philosophy for Children is today, and what the priorities are and how these priorities have perhaps shifted from when Matt and Anne were first starting out. We're happy to discuss these with you if you're interested, but I don't want to take up any more time because we've gone, I think, about 10 minutes over time. So we'll open it up to people to ask questions, make comments, share information. Unless you have any final remarks, Maughn.
No, thank you. I think we should move to questions. Thank you.
Oh, great. Thank you so much. So this is an invitation for all of you who's been listening. If you have any special question or clarification, Rico.
Can you hear me?
Mm-hmm. Hi, Rico.
Hi, great to see you all. And Tulsa too, great to see you. Okay, so my question is about caring thinking. I don't know, was it Maughn or Megan who told that Lipman and Sharp had different views about caring thinking? I would like to hear more about that. Like, how do you see those differences?
Sure. I'll start, and then maybe you can jump in. So Matt Lipman, in the first edition of his book, Thinking in Education, his construct of what higher order thinking consisted of was critical and creative thinking. And obviously the critical thinking movement was big already. And Matt was saying, but you also need, if you're going to do philosophy, philosophical inquiry also requires creative thinking as well as critical thinking. So that was his construct. And then by the time his second edition of Thinking in Education came out, he had added caring thinking. And this was an idea that he and Sharp, in our there's no direct record of this, but in our working with both of them, we think it's, the way it happened was that Anne was sort of nudging Matt that you've got to have something with the emotions and something about feelings and something about, it's not, it can't just be creative and critical and creative. But Matt's first iteration of caring thinking was that it's values oriented, that it's the kind of thinking we do around things that we care about, that we deeply value. So one of his examples, and this comes from his background in aesthetics, was the curator of a museum. The way a curator thinks about the paintings or the objects, the art objects in a museum. Like, how do I preserve these? How do I embellish? How do I share the value of these things with the public? And so he was saying that, like, when we're doing philosophy, when we're being critical and creative, it's not like we hold our values outside. We bracket our values as something that's not relevant to our thinking. No, we bring our values inside our thinking as our values should inform our thinking. And I think Anne Sharp would agree with all that, but she brought a different perspective to it. She talked more about emotions and interpersonal relationships and that kind of thing. So when you're doing philosophical inquiry, you also need to be consulting all of your emotions. If you are experiencing fear or dread or friendship or erotic love or whatever it is, there's a kernel of there's a kernel of knowledge in those emotions that you need to explore as part of your inquiry. And the interpersonal relationships that you, especially in a community of inquiry, you need to be paying deep attention to the relationships that form and get shaped in that experience, and always keep that in the front. And so caring about the community, caring about our relationships, caring about each other is a fundamental part of doing philosophy. Megan, what can you help me?
Yeah. No, I love what Maughn said. I would just add one thing to that, and it's related to what Maughn said, and I'm wondering whether Maughn would agree. I think that Anne took it one step further, in part because she was really persuaded by the relational views of the individual that came out, you know, at the time of Nell Nodding's work, the feminists' work on care ethics, and also when Levinas was being translated into English. So Anne was reading these people, and I think she found an idea of the subject or individual as relational really powerful, and she wanted to begin to think about thinking in the context of a relational self. Whereas I think Matt still worked within the notion of an individual, an autonomous, ideally an autonomous individual making judgments for himself or herself or their self. And so that marked a difference, I think, in how care figured in their thinking about its relationship to thinking and to the practice of philosophy for children and the community of inquiry.
Thank you. Very good answers.
Anne also had, she wrote about ecological care a number of times. And I don't know enough about the post-humanist philosophy, but I think Anne was in some ways a precursor, because she often wrote that you can't, if you're going to do philosophy and do it well and do it seriously, you're eventually going to have to realize that you belong to an ecological network that you need to care about and bring that into the inquiry.
Hans raised his hand.
Thank you, Megan and Maughn, for your reflections and your explanations. What I was thinking about when you were talking about the founders, they address to children in particular, was that because of the fact that children are more conceptive for what I call imagination and fantasy, which are conditions for exercising of philosophy. Did they think about that the same way, or had they in mind that they could be good parents to their children? I mean, you understand what I'm trying to say? It always begins with the children and in the environment they are raising, which is also a condition, I think, for a way of thinking free with an open mind. Had they that in mind as well?
Want to start this? Am I jumping in?
I thought I'd let you start, Maughn. And I can, do you want me? I mean, I like to add.
I'll just say that in terms of imagination, yes, particularly, well, one of the interesting differences we found was that for Gareth Matthews, you don't need to teach children how to do philosophy. They're already doing it. In his early essays on this, there did not exist transcripts of young children's talk. So he went looking around and he found a psychology textbook from the 1930s that included some transcripts of children just talking to each other. And he said, there, you can see they're doing philosophy when they do this and this and this. They're already having philosophical thinking, and they're already having, sharing and exchanging philosophical ideas with each other. So it's not that we bring philosophy to them. Children are just naturally already philosophers. He did think that adults, and he thought adults could gain, it was really adults who would gain from doing philosophy with children. It was not that children, well, he developed this idea that he called the mirror image conception of childhood and adulthood, where children and adults bring different strengths to the philosophical enterprise. And so doing it together, they enhance each other. But it was not the idea that adults do philosophy better, and so by doing it with children, they could teach children how to do it better. Whereas for Lipman and Sharp, they had a conception that children are capable of doing philosophy, but they really do need this curriculum. They need to be exposed to the ideas from the philosophical tradition, and they need the community of inquiry to sort of show them how it's done. And if you do that, then they can do it. Maybe I'll stop there, and Megan, you can jump in.
Yeah, I've just got a couple of things to add to that, what he said. And I think Matthews thought that the process of being socialized into becoming an adult and being educated in schools socialized all the wonder and philosophical inquiry and imagination, all the things you were talking about, Hans, out of the child. And so that's why adults had so much to gain from being able to philosophize with children. A second thing that I think points to a difference is that at least for Anne, I know less well about Matt, her investment in philosophizing with children was her commitment to the idea that I think she takes from Nietzsche, that the discipline of philosophy is part of the child's inheritance. They have a right to be exposed to the philosophical tradition. And the problem is that if you don't do philosophy prior to college level, a lot of people miss out on their inheritance. And she was really kind of motivated by that in a way that Matthews, I mean, he was invested in the tradition, but he didn't see himself as giving that tradition to children or even giving them access to that tradition, because what he valued so much was the philosophical impulse that he felt that was natural there in kids. All of them, I think, thought that all of them were committed to respecting children, independent, I suppose, of how you conceived of childhood. And that seemed really important to them. I mean, all of them conceived of childhood in a positive way, but I think for them equally as important was just this issue of respect and how we treat children.
Great.
Thank you very much, both of you. Thank you.
I'm really curious about your thoughts on the first question there, where you said that where you posed the question whether Lipman was naive, and I suppose sharp as well, in what, how strong an effect or the community of inquiry or philosophy with children could be in mitigating, for example, sexism and racism. What are your thoughts on that?
Do you want to start? I would have to say yes. My personal answer is yes. And I think we're learning more and more why that's the case. So the idea, this is something my Department of Educational Foundations has debated for decades, between professors who are promoting the idea that if you just teach critical thinking and philosophical inquiry skills, you need to not to do that well is to not tell children what to think about certain issues, including racism, even racism. If you just teach really good thinking and good inquiry skills, children will figure out on their own that racism is wrong, for example, and they'll learn how to notice racism and sexism and these other problems. But my own thinking is that that's naive because, particularly nowadays, because of technology and media, the way technology and media saturate children's lives, and the way that sexism and racism and homophobia and ageism and other kinds of oppression saturate media, means that it's a force, it's a detrimental force that is part of the reason it's so strong and that it works so well is because you don't recognize that it's happening to you. We don't recognize the racism in the media that we consume, even as adults. And so if you don't have a curriculum that is explicitly anti-racist, for example, I think that's really hard to combat. And so like Walter Cohen he said in one of his writings somewhere, I think this was in the, maybe in the Matthews book, that, for example, you don't see an explicit critique of capitalism in any of the novels that Lipman wrote. And as Megan pointed out, his first wife was African-American, and so their children were mixed race. And you do see that coming out in the novels here and there, but in a subtle way. It's not like the novels don't address racism explicitly. It's in the background. You have to really dig for it. So I'll stop and let Megan have a word.
Sorry, I'm grappling with noise. Yeah, I mean, I think I agree with Maughn. But for me, it just raises, I think, more questions about what it is to develop an anti-racist philosophy curriculum, like what that would look like and what it would be like to teach it. And it also raises, for me, questions about the value or the enduring value of the Lipman novels. Like what their status is, because I think there's a different conception of the thinker or the person being educated to make the judgments at play in the Lipman novels or the Lipman and Sharp curriculum, and what we would recognize as an anti-racist philosophy curriculum. So it sort of makes me excited for the future of philosophy for children, because I think it's going to look and feel different. from what we've inherited. And there are going to be different kinds of debates and discussions going on. There are going to be so many more questions to resolve and talk about. But I'm not sure it's just a matter of the Lipman and Sharp curriculum. I'm not sure if it's simply a matter of kind of taking the model and applying it to issues of race, racism or sexism. So, yeah.
Great, thank you so much. I think most of us, or some of us at least, are most engaged with community of inquiry with adults or adolescents, but it's really the same thing in certain ways at least. So that's a really central part of the missioning movement, if you will. So that's why you have to take care and think about what you, I guess, what you think that you will achieve by doing it and having more of it in society. It's 8:02, so the time is actually up. And unless somebody has a quick question, then Linus, is that okay with Megan and Maughn and the rest of you? If you don't want to stay, you're obviously free to go, not Megan and Maughn. But Linus, please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, Tulsa. And thank you, Megan and Maughn. Fasti, I just want to ask, because I keep on seeing the two terms being thrown together, philosophy with children and philosophy for children. Is this two different streams of how to view the practice and the purpose of the practice, so to speak, or is it just different names? Thank you.
I have two answers to that. I recently uncovered a sketch that Matthew Lipman wrote addressing that very question. And his answer was kind of in terms of what Megan was talking about before, about seeing the role of philosophy in the reform of education. So for Matt Lipman, when you say philosophy for children, you're talking about using philosophy to reform education. It's not just a program you visit, like a visiting philosopher will come into a school and do philosophy for an hour and then go away. And Matt thought that difference was really important. And so he personally resisted the phrase philosophy with children. I don't know of anybody else in the contemporary movement who has that distinction in mind. So what I see now in the philosophy of children world is that people use those terms interchangeably. Of course, the grammatically, to say we're doing philosophy with children is a more accurate description of what you see in the Lipman and Sharp program than philosophy for children, which could mean, teaching philosophy to children in some old-fashioned kind of way. So for me, there's no difference. For me, they're interchangeable. You really have to look at what people are doing. In other words, you can't tell a difference in what people might be doing by what they're calling it, if they're using one of those phrases or a different phrase. There's a number of different phrases people use. But I think you really have to look at what they're actually doing and ask them, why are you doing this? Like, why do you think it's important to engage somehow children with philosophy, with or without adults? What's the purpose of that, and how do you do it? How do you go about it? You really have to do that to find out what the differences are. Megan, what do you think?
Yeah, I agree with Maughn. I think I would say, I don't know how Anne responded to this sketch by Matthew Lipman, but I think for Anne, again, just repeating what I'd said, part of what is embedded in the idea of philosophy for children is the bringing of the discipline, like giving them the discipline, which is their inheritance, however you do that. So you're not simply engaging in philosophical inquiry, you're doing something more than just that. But I agree with Maughn that the doing of it looks the same or largely the same. And I do think the terms are used interchangeably today. But perhaps there's a connection between Lipman's interest in educational reform, one that Sharp shared with him, and Sharp's interest in bequeathing the discipline of philosophy to children as part of their cultural inheritance.
I'll just add the one little detail that that it's a feature, it's an important feature of the Lipman-Sharp curriculum. This idea that Megan's talking about, the inheritance, and this is another critique that they really focused on the Western philosophical tradition. So there's a lot to be debated about in that regard too. But just in terms of seeing the Western philosophical tradition as a birthright that children have a right to access, their curriculum attempts to do that. For example, if you're going to talk about a certain issue that children often talk about, they have the right to know that in the history of philosophy, there may have been 4 or 5 different major positions on that issue. And if their own discussion doesn't raise all 5 of them, then you have this curriculum, the manual you can bring in. You can say, well, did you know that there are other positions than the ones that you've just raised that you might consider, that you have the right to know about and to consider as possible different kinds of answers to the question that was raised. It's that kind of thing that they had in mind.
And if I could add to that, I actually think that's important in the case of thinking about their naivety regarding sexism and other forms of oppression, because there's the political ethical issue here that we need to, transform the world so that it moves towards greater social justice. But it's also the case that philosophy is changing. And so philosophy now includes the philosophy of race, the philosophy of gender, the philosophy of ageism, environmentalism. And so if you think of philosophy as a birthright, then you think of those areas of inquiry as a birthright as well. So that's a very different way of looking at what it might mean for a philosophy for children curriculum to incorporate those areas of concern.
Thank you. I could add just very shortly also that I've come across people who were very passionate about, I asked them if they were doing philosophy for children, and he said, no, I'm doing philosophy with children. And I'm like, I thought he was joking. I'm like, what's the difference? But I'm thinking that maybe, it's actually almost like a trademark, P4C, and that you could possibly, think that it also stands for the Lipman-Sharp tradition. So maybe, that could be significant in some way for some people. But of course, we're all doing philosophy with people. And so the trademark is not maybe that important. It's what you do and how you do it, of course.
I think that's a nice point.
You're right. Yeah, really good point.
So I don't want to keep you any longer because we have passed our time. And so I want to thank you both, Maughn and Megan, for your insightful talk and for sharing and giving us tips for reading your books, the ones that are out and the ones that are forthcoming.
Thank you.
And thank you so much, everybody who has attended. And please remember that we have other seminars coming up, so keep looking at our website. And this one will be also available for those who want to revisit the seminar on our YouTube channel. So thank you so much, everybody, and I hope I will see you soon.
Thank you.
Thank you.